Well, isn't it something that the issue that looks like it's going to rupture the states, unlike any other issue has ruptured it in a long time, is the issue of a combination issue, police brutality on the one side, racialized police brutality on the other side. Now, there's a lot of reasons for the US to, I guess, rupture, but anything racial, that's not one of the reasons. So if they're going to have Civil War 2.0, they should have it based on something else that doesn't have anything to do with race, and specifically how race interplays with law enforcement. And I say this because, and I'll insert why at the end, because I'll play an audio clip that just goes through, from Wiki, it just goes through different statistics about police using lethal force and how there may or may not be racial patterns to it. And the article cites study after study that reaches different conclusions. These are not bad internet actors compiling these studies. These are statisticians and other people who are not known for playing with numbers. These are not the sort of typical propagandists playing with numbers. These are scholars. These are generally well-intentioned actors. And despite that, we see study after study contradict. We see one study contradict the previous one in terms of whether there is a systemic racial pattern in the way of police using lethal force and police brutality in general, and how this justifies or speaks against a movement like Black Lives Matter. So there's no such thing. Based on that, right? So even a statistician, someone who lives, eats, and breathes this stuff, statistical analysis, even a statistician, if they read studies comprehensively, not just one little corner of statistical analysis, if they read from A to Z the studies that have been done on this, even a statistician will find it hard to have a justified belief on this. They may have they may come to a conclusion, and that conclusion may be true or false. Right? So Black Lives Matter is a justified movement. Their core claim that there is a racial component, predominantly racial component, in police brutality in a country like America, like the Black Lives Matter verdict on that is affirmative. There is, and therefore our movement needs to exist. So a statistician may agree with that, but it will not be a justified belief. The only way to have a justified belief on something like this is to observe that the studies contradict each other. There's been a lot of studies, and they come to different conclusions. So a hands-off approach until we see dissimilar conclusions converge on some sort of similarity. We are not near that right now. I'll play the clip at the end of the video going over the idea of racial patterns not being as one-sidedly patterned as these cloistered political groups want to have you believe. So even a statistician who comes down decisively in favor or against something like Black Lives Matter, that may be true or false, but it is not justified, because it means that statistician, having been decisive and adamant, probably wasn't paying close enough attention to the wide range of studies. And you go wide enough in that range, you'll notice things that contradict your view. And that's even statisticians. Suffice it to say, most people who have passionate views on this are nowhere close to having the sort of grasp of statistic your average statistician might. So if something's gonna freaking rupture the country, it can't be something that just about no one who is involved has justified beliefs on. Now, I thought I said everything I needed to say about race. 2017 video it was. I make the sort of points that are mostly in line with the sort of points you hear if you listen to Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, you listen to Coleman Hughes. Looks at race in a whole variety of ways, not just in terms of how race interacts with police brutality. But there are those views, and I don't want to come on and make the same sort of video that I made back then, especially since those arguments are far more powerful when they come from individuals like Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, and Coleman Hughes, and so on. Maybe Thomas Sowell to an extent. But Thomas Sowell probably oversteps in certain things. and believes that bootstraps are the way to go, and that's at best a half-truth. But Glenn Loury, John McWhorter, Coleman Hughes, the holy trinity of, I guess, black voices, right? People talking, we need to listen to black voices. Okay, absolutely. I encourage people to listen to black voices. Listen to those three guys. They nail the subject. They nail it. And yet, they're not the sort of black voices a fanatical Black Lives Matter proponent would tell you to go listen to. Black Lives Matter type will tell you to listen to Jesse Jackson, Cornel West, the sort of everything is structural narrative. It's so frustrating. It's so frustrating because I don't want to come on here and just echo the arguments I've made in the past or parrot the additional arguments Hughes, Loury, McWhorter have made. I don't want to do that because when they make it, if those arguments fall on deaf ears, of course they'll fall on deaf ears when I make those arguments. So, but I don't want to be silent on the issue either because the issue is inescapable. Try your best to escape it. You can only do so for so long. Sooner or later, something will infiltrate whatever you're trying to do. You'll notice it. You'll notice it in the way of headlines. If you are stupid like me and even lurk Twitter, I don't tweet, but I lurk Twitter, you'll notice it then. It's something's inescapable, and inescapable for this many days. Right now we're in day, 13 of nonstop racializing of police brutality. An issue that, again, even if there's cause, even if the statistics that speak in favor of police departments being racially motivated, even if that's true, you have to know that politically it's going to be divisive. Because there's no reason that suddenly the people who denied that there's a racial component to these killings, that you're going to wake them up because one particular viral video was especially egregious, and that's going to be enough for all the people who denied this to stop denying it and to suddenly join Black Lives Matter. No, I'm telling you, regardless of what a rock-solid viral video you have, it could be twice as bad, 3 times as bad, 4 times as bad as the one with George Floyd. The people who resist the Black Lives Matter movement are not going to join the Black Lives Matter movement. Even if you roll out 10, 20, 30 studies in a row, they'll find some studies of their own to say the opposite conclusion is actually true. So if police brutality is a problem, you have to target that through race-neutral ways. Then and only then will you amass a large enough coalition just on that single issue to get from point A to point B. Racializing it, it's counterproductive. If you actually want some sort of legislation like different training, like upping the use of tasers as opposed to lethal force. Defunding, no, defunding is not, no, you get what you pay for. So the moment you talk about defunding police departments as opposed to get them better training, that's again. But my overriding point is, if you racialize, you will, even if your beliefs might be true at the end of the day, they won't be justified. Even if they're true, you will alienate some segment of people, and you could have had a larger coalition on that one issue. So why is that? Why do I need to say anything more at this point? Why is that not enough? Why can't people be a little more operationally attentive when they view themselves as activists, right? I've spoken against activism in the past, and it's just the ultimate irony that I've spoken against activism in the past, and yet I'm the one who is the most, what is operationally effective versus ineffective? That's supposed to be the activists' bread and butter. Even if you think something's true, you got to think, will this truth alienate people who are politically minded? And if it will alienate, maybe we'll be a quietist about it. Maybe we should all be quietists about the racial element of this so that we can amass a larger coalition who will be off-put by the answer, yes, it is racially driven. Police departments are universally across the country racist because racism is structural, it's built into the structure. there's no shortage of evidence that there's a large potential coalition that is made less large because you push that line, because BLM pushes that line. If it's far more important to actually get the policy to change, to actually get better performance from the cops who are right now committing these acts of police brutality, if that's number one on the agenda, then everything else has to fall by the wayside. Right? So when you're truth-telling, when you're speaking truth to power, assuming it is absolutely true, and any study that speaks against it is false, okay, even then you should understand, just at the level of optics and strategy, that you gotta be a quietist about it. There are times when things are predictable enough in terms of opposition, that people are incorrigible, and you ought to just rein in that impulse to speak truth to power. Or maybe there's something else going on. Maybe they don't believe the size of the coalition will be effective. Maybe they think it's about something else. Maybe they think a smaller coalition that's just more rowdy and threatening and, well, if we just have enough arsonists, looters, vandals, that's going to get us further. Yeah, it's just, why is this subject so goddamn repetitive? Why can't we get from point A to point B? Okay, here's the ultimate example. I understand if you're an American and you're particularly concerned with racism in America. So racism in America is just another way of saying white majority racism. Why is there zero appetite, zero intellectual curiosity in terms of worldwide racism? Now, I like I said, I stressed it's okay if you're an American to be predominantly interested in the sort of racism that occurs with, I guess it's still a white majority population. Okay, it's a white majority population. You live in that country with the white majority. You can be predominantly interested in white on non-white racism in your own country. Fine. But why is that the only sort of racism you're interested in? Even if we assume that the structural racism as defined by structural and never personal, which is actually just another way of saying caste, right? We had a perfectly good term for what you mean by structural racism, and defining out of existence non-structural racism as if it shouldn't even be referred to as racism anymore. No. Structural racism is just what we used to refer to as caste, but I guess that term doesn't convey what you want it to convey anymore. So now racism can just mean prejudice. No, it has to mean prejudice plus power. Okay, fine. Even then, assume that's fine. Caste is just not a good enough term. We have to use a term like structural or institutional racism. Fine. Why do you have zero curiosity in terms of this sort of structural racism in non-white majority countries? Like, if you want to have 95% of the time, if you want to analyze white majority countries and how non-whites are mistreated in those countries, fine. But 5% of the time. You know how I know that no one's interested in this? It's because I can't find stats. I can't find stats because for a long time I've been trying to get to the bottom of the average white majority country, just the average one, compared to the average non-white majority country. So how the average white majority country treats non-whites across a wide range of, I guess, life outcomes is one way to look at it, whether they are objective life outcomes versus self-assessment outcomes, however you want to do this, life satisfaction. Like, how do non-whites fare in these white majority countries? Average it all out and then give them a score. Give them a report card. Right? Not just America, but all white majority countries. So we can do that, right? Because we know that a lot of these white majority countries have the sort of research institutions where they keep tabs on this stuff. So it's probably very easy to do. And let's just say that, okay, so you average all of it out, and white majority countries gets up like a C plus on how non-whites are treated there. But to have zero curiosity for one such report card when it comes to non-white majority countries, not just because of how those non-white majority countries treat the white minorities in there, but because of how they treat all other minorities in their countries. And I have a sneaky suspicion that the report card, if we had the sort of tools to be able to amass that information, it wouldn't be a C plus. They would fare worse. And it doesn't mean that you have to emphasize that worse report card if you are an activist in a white majority country. By all means, still push for your white supremacy based narratives 95% of the time. But every now and then point out that, you know what, as bad as we are, those countries are still worse. Why does mouthing this point create the sort of impulse for the people who resist it that, well, I'm one of two things here by suggesting this. I am a part of some pipeline, IDW to alt-light to alt-right pipeline, right? So I'm up to something. Or B, I'm a useful idiot for those kinds of bad actors. I'm just their dupe. This is not a valid, intellectually curious thing to do. No, it's some talking point. Makes you a dupe for the neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, neo-Confederates, and so on and so forth. I cannot stomach the lack of curiosity for the effects of racism worldwide. So I don't want to ascribe ulterior motives. I don't think they have ulterior motives. The person who thinks it's a matter of ulterior motives is the person who will say something in the way of blah, 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 neo-Marxist indoctrination. I'm not saying that's at the bottom of it, but there is some kind of psychological / emotional inability to universalize and to be selective. And that's not good. And even this weak case that I'm making, this is a very weak case that I'm making. I said you can still, even if the report card of the non-white majority nations is far worse in terms of how they treat their minorities, non-white majority nations is worse in terms of how they treat their minorities, even if it's far worse than the C plus of the white majority nations and how they treat their minorities, you can still apportion the majority of your time and efforts to combating white supremacy, if you want to call it that. But just don't be exclusive in that. I should point out, though, that when I say it's impossible to come up with a justified account that gives a sweeping yes or sweeping no, the sweeping bit is important in that statement. It's a large country. There's a lot of police departments across a lot of counties. So that's not to say that just because it's tough, it's a very tall task to come up with a verdict that encompasses the whole country and condemns the entire country. It's not to say that it's as much of a tall task to do that when it comes to a given precinct. So if statisticians have zeroed in on a given precinct and done study after study across different periods, and the results show a consistent ruling, then you can target that particular police department in that precinct. But that takes a lot of work, even when it's a single precinct. And if there have been such studies which don't contradict each other, like I usually hear negative things about the Chicago case, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if there's zero statisticians that deny that there have been certain problems that have been consistent in terms of how Chicago targets non-whites. Then that's fair play. But it's just a completely different story to condemn the entire country's police conduct as compared to a single precinct. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say, look, I'm obviously frustrated with this, but at the same time, in certain periods, I sound like I'm very self-satisfied with the points I'm making. That's one of the reasons why it's just so tough to upload, because even when I am at my most frustrated, I rarely, if ever, go a full video without at least a couple of times in the video sounding like I'm making a sort of point that makes me very self-satisfied. Now I'm just so giddy about the fact that I get to make this point. And I'm trying to be attentive to that, because it's one of the reasons why I can't stand anyone on YouTube. Just no. If you are talking to a camera, odds are, if I've listened to you long enough, you've sounded like you're having way too much fun. And it's just, whether I agree or disagree with you, I find you unstomachable. And it's not just YouTube, it's, you know, to a lesser extent, when it comes to professional journalists and news anchors, you see it in them too, but you see it in them much less than you see it with YouTubers. And I'm part of the problem. That's why I barely ever vlog anymore. The self-satisfaction, we have to do our best. If we want to be effective messengers, if we actually want to broaden our coalition and get people to think more deeply about our points, it just strikes me how often I fail to think more deeply about a given antagonist when I listen to them speak. Because if they're on YouTube, and I'm telling you, they'll be very self-satisfied as they're making their points. And it's usually when I venture off into into text land, as I tend to do, I'll find myself being far more receptive to a point that I may have not given much time to before. And if I see an author, usually philosopher, make what is more or less the same argument, but strictly in text, I'm like, wow, I'm actually nodding along to an argument that I dismissed years ago because I was only ever exposed to that argument by listening to someone speak about it. And especially bad if they gang up. And so usually this is like when it comes to these live streams. Live streams are just anathema when it comes to trying to actually challenge yourself, because it's usually just a circle jerk, and everyone is, if they're in a circle jerk, they'll be especially satisfied with themselves because they've got the social backing, and they can almost see their own social prestige rising because they're in like-minded land. So it's just, I've recently had this string of experiences where there have been points that I've only ever been exposed to in the past from the sort of messenger who was very much in love with themselves. And then I just saw the point made in cold hard text, and it didn't sway me, but I understood that the point has a lot more going for it when it was made in a very detached way. So it's always good to try your best. If you are going to speak, try your best to sound like you're not just loving what you're doing. And I know half the time I look frustrated, so it's kind of, it works. But I know that at least in a couple of times, in every single video, at least a couple of times, I just sound like I'm having fun. And it's not fun. And if it looks like it's fun, then it looks like it's more fun than it actually feels from the other side. But I guess the ultimate advice would be, don't vlog and don't watch vloggers. Just immerse yourself in text. It'll be better from a self-challenging standpoint, because whatever perks, whatever individual quirks, because whichever individual quirks the messenger who's pissing you off has, odds are the person writing the argument down won't have those quirks, and you'll be able to just get on and focus on the point. All right, now for a couple of things. So I'll do the article discussing the contradictory studies, and then before that I'll do a community post, which everyone needs to see as well, that I did a few days ago. That's about the looting problem. There's an additional problem to all this, the looting problem, which I didn't really speak about, but I did a community post on it, and by golly, I'm playing that community post.
So that's my post. I was inspired to write this up after I read this article that I linked to at the bottom. And this is a Princeton professor who studies mass protests and their effects on politics and elections. And so this is just me going off on the looting. Without really going off on it, I try to be as diplomatic as possible. But yeah, I'm clearly annoyed with some of the effects, because there are effects. And this is plenty of data. So what we observed in the 1960s, this is him writing. I'm not going to read my part. You can just look through it if you want. But what he writes in the article is that what we observe in the 1960s is that there was a non-trivial number of white moderates who were open to policies that advanced racial equality and were also very concerned about order. The needle that civil rights activists were trying to thread was, how do you advance racial equality and capture the attention of often indifferent or hostile white moderates outside of the South, and at the same time grow a coalition of allies? And over time, the strategy that evolved was one of nonviolent protests, which actively sought to trigger police chiefs like Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama, to engage in spectacles of violence that attracted national media and would, in the language of the 1960s, quote, shock the conscience of the nation. So it isn't just nonviolence that is effective, but nonviolence met with state and vigilante brutality that is effective. The interesting thing to me that came out of this research was that civil rights leaders were picking Birmingham and Selma specifically because they had police chiefs with hair-trigger tendencies toward violence. So there was this strategic use of violence by a civil rights movement, but it was to be the object of violence, not the instigators of violence. At the same time, what was very hard about with that strategy is that you had images of people observing their kinfolk being brutalized on television, and that helped fire up a more militant wing of the civil rights movement, which endorsed violence in self-defense and was much less committed to tactics of nonviolence. When we observed a wave of violent protests in the mid to late 60s, those white moderates who supported the Democratic Party after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 defected to the Republican Party in 1968. So when the state was employing violence and protesters were the targets of that violence, the strategy worked well. And when protesters engaged in violence, whether or not the state was, those voters moved to the law and order coalition. And this is why I end up writing what I end up. I will never understand refusals to pander to a subset of wedge issue voters who care intensely and candidly about something as uncontentious as order. And this is, of course, in terms of the recent events. And there have been a lot of refusals to pander to those voters and to make excuses for the riots and the looting and things of that sort. Really now, just condemn the violent protesters unambiguously, without ifs and buts, and tell every outlet interviewing you that people's pro-order/anti-disorder convictions are perfectly understandable and legitimate, read, not the manifestation of white privilege, ulterior motives, creeping white lash, gross empathy gaps, etc. And since the week and a half of me having written up that post, we've just seen more of the same. People have doubled down on their excuse making of the looting or downplaying of it. The condemnations, but certainly with a lot of ifs and buts and things of that sort. That's why I say at the end, or up your odds of losing in November, whatever. And it seems like that's what they want to do. Well, that's not what they want to do, but that's what they're going to end up probably upping their odds of doing, because they can think in terms of the operational realities of what it takes to win. You got to pander to the right groups on an issue when it's uncontentious. And if anything should be an uncontentious issue, it should be order. So that's the full article. And again, it's a professor who has gathered up, a professor at Princeton, who has gathered up plenty of data to back all of this up. So I suggest reading the full article. That's about all I'm going to read now, because I'm going to move on to something else at this point. All right, moving on to police use of deadly force in the United States. And the first thing to note with this article is usually when there's an article that's contested on Wiki, it is right there at the top of the page, big bold letters. This article has problems with it. It's worded in one of those ways. This article has not been contested in any such way. And one of the first things they mention at the very top, before they even get into the contents, is due to a lack of reliable data, it is difficult for researchers to draw causal inferences as to whether racial discrimination affects police use of deadly force. A 2017 and 2020 study concluded that police do not use deadly force more frequently against black suspects than white suspects. Researchers have disputed those studies, one of which issued a correction stating that they draw conclusions the data does not support. If police have a higher suspicion threshold for stopping whites than blacks, then the blacks and whites who are stopped are not similar, which leads to unreliable inferences about racial discrimination in police use of deadly force. Ties back to what I said about justification parting ways with whether a belief is true. And it should be uncontentious, probably what I should have said at the very beginning when I recorded this at the outset of the video, is that it is better to have a justified false belief than an unjustified true belief, which is just an accidentally true belief. Hopefully that's not too controversial. Moving on to some of the meat and potatoes of the article. So, according to the Guardian's database, in 2016, the rate of fatal police shootings per million was 10.3 for Native Americans, 6.6 for Black people, 3.23 for Hispanics, 2.9 for white people, and 1.17 for Asians. By total, police more frequently killed whites than any other race or ethnicity. As a percentage of the US population, however, Black Americans were 2.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by the police in 2015. A 2015 study found that unarmed blacks were 3.49 times more likely to be shot by the police than were unarmed whites. Another study published in 2016 concluded that the mortality rate of legal interventions among Black and Hispanic people was 2.8 and 1.7 times higher than that among white people. Another 2015 study concluded that Black people were 2.8 times more likely to be killed by police than whites. They also concluded that Black people were more likely to be unarmed than white people, who were in turn more likely to be unarmed than Hispanic people shot by the police. A 2018 study in the American Journal of Public Health found the mortality rate by police per 100,000 people was 1.9 to 2.4 for Black men, 0.8 to 1.2 for Hispanic men, and 0.6 to 0.7 for white men. So far, pretty smooth sailing, nothing much to contradict. But slowly but surely we get into some contradiction land. A 2015 study by Harvard professor Roland G. Fryer Jr. found that there was no racial bias in the use of lethal police force between Black and white suspects in similar situations. The study did, however, find Blacks and Hispanics are significantly more likely to experience non-lethal use of force. A 2019 paper by Princeton University political scientists disputed the findings by Fryer, saying that if police had a higher threshold for stopping whites, this might mean that the whites, Hispanics, and Blacks in Fryer's data are not similar. In 2016, a 2016 study published in the journal Injury Prevention concluded that African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos were more likely to be stopped by police compared to Asians and whites, but found that there was no racial bias in the likelihood of being killed or injured after being stopped. A January 2017 report by the DOJ found that the Chicago Police Department had, quote, unconstitutionally engaged in a pattern of excessive and deadly force, and an independent task force created by the mayor of Chicago stated that police, quote, have no regard for the sanctity of life when it comes to people of color. A 2018 study found that minorities are disproportionately killed by police, but that white officers are not more likely to use lethal force on blacks than minority officers. A 2019 study in the Journal of Politics found that police officers were more likely to use lethal force on blacks, but that this was, quote, most likely driven by higher rates of police contact among African Americans rather than racial differences in the circumstances of the interaction and officer bias in application of lethal force. A 2019 study in the Journal of Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences found that blacks and American Indian/Alaska Natives are more likely to be killed by police than whites, and that Latino men are more likely to be killed than white men. According to the study, quote, for young men of color, police use of force is among the leading causes of death. A 2019 study in PNAS concluded concluded from a data set of fatal shootings that white officers were not more likely to shoot minority civilians than non-white officers. Quote, "We did not find evidence for anti-black or anti-Hispanic disparity in police use of force across all shootings and, if anything, found anti-white disparities when controlling for race-specific crime." The study was widely criticized by other academics who stated that the study's conclusion could not be supported by the data. The study was refuted, and in a subsequent PNAS article, which stated that the study rests on the erroneous assumption that police encounter minorities and whites at the same rate, and that if police have a higher threshold for stopping whites who engage in suspicious behavior than blacks, then the data on police shootings masks the discrimination. PNAS issued a correction to the original article. A subsequent 2020 study in the American Political Science Review found that there was racial bias in who was stopped by the police. The authors of the study used data on stops in New York, concluding that 39% of Black and Hispanics who were subjected to non-lethal force by police would not have been if they were white. An early study, published in 1977, found that a disproportionately high percent of those killed by police were racial minorities compared to their representation in the general population. The same study, however, noted that this proportion is consistent with the number of minorities arrested for serious felonies. A 1977 analysis of reports from major metropolitan departments found officers fired more shots at white suspects than at black suspects, possibly because of, quote, public sentiment concerning treatment of blacks. A 1978 report found that 60% of black people shot by the police were armed with handguns, compared to 35% of white people shot. A 2014 study involving computer-based simulations of a police encounter using police officers and undergraduates found a greater likelihood to shoot black targets instead of whites for the undergraduate students, but for the police, they generally found no biased pattern of shooting. Another study in Washington State University used realistic police simulators of different scenarios where a police officer might use deadly force. The study concluded that unarmed white suspects were 3 times more likely to be shot than unarmed black suspects. The study concluded that the results could be because officers were more concerned with using deadly force against black suspects for fear of how it would be perceived. Officer characteristics. 2019 study found that the racial identity of police officers is not a significant predictor in the use of deadly force. Studies have shown that the administrative policies regarding police use of deadly force are associated with reduced use of such force by law enforcement officers. Using less lethal weapons such as tasers can also significantly reduce injuries related to use of force events. So it's all about better training. It sounds trite, but it really does take the cake over alternative solutions like defunding police departments, much less abolishing. Prison abolitionism is one of the most insane pieces of, I guess, hopeful legislation I have ever encountered. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let them smokescreen it away. It is exactly what it sounds. So yeah, but that's the contradictions in data. We are not at a point where we have airtight data on something like this if we want to target wide regional targets. You want to target a single police department? Okay, you might have something closer to consistency across different decades and generations, but you're talking cross-generational conclusions, forget about it. You need to be humble because you're always going to have something that throws a wrench in a sweeping conclusion. Now talk about neglected solutions. No one's even proposing this. There's data that backs up a phenomenon called the cross-race effect. A couple of other names to it. The tendency to more easily recognize faces that are most familiar, but then if you go to the consequences section, cross-race identification bias. This effect refers to the decreased ability of people of one race to recognize faces and facial expressions of people of another race. This differs from the cross-race bias because this effect is found mostly during eyewitness identification, as well as identification of a suspect in a lineup. In these situations, many people feel as if races other than their own look alike, and they have difficulty distinguishing between members of different ethnic groups. Cross-race identification bias is also known as the misinformation effect, since people are considered to be misinformed about other races and have difficulty identifying them. So then it goes on about the studies. I'm not going to read that. You can read that for yourselves. The point is, if this is the norm, studies indicate it very much is, and if the ways to reduce this are not exactly in full swing, we can expect that whatever reduction may occur is not going to occur overnight. So for the time being, as much as every fiber of my being wants to say color blindness should rule the roost, I can see that in a context like this, a context like law enforcement, policing, high crime neighborhoods, if they are predominantly black neighborhoods, certain pockets of the country, then black cops should be overrepresented in those neighborhoods. If everything pans out in terms of this research, which there is no criticism section, so if I am unaware of some criticism of this research that's knockdown criticism, by all means let me know. If the research is solid, which it is, then wouldn't you want to have a proposal to some of this? Would you not want to have black cops reduce this effect? Black cops, as opposed to white ones, being better able to recognize the actual suspects and not just fungibility of suspects. And this sort of fungibility goes a long way in explaining why so many people get harassed. Innocent people, law-abiding people get harassed in black majority neighborhoods, inner cities, where black cops are not overrepresented. This phenomenon right here. And yeah, it's not a colorblind solution. You can have colorblind solutions overnight. So I guess another example of people who are saying color blindness is naive, being right, but right for the wrong reasons, not for the reasons they think. They don't cite stuff like this. I've never seen a skeptic of color blindness cite something like this in order to argue for a particular policy. We know the sort of rote thinking they employ to argue stuff like that. It's certainly not database thinking. But yeah, I would have no problem having white cops overrepresented in white majority neighborhoods, and likewise with any other race, for as long as this is a ubiquitous effect across the population. This, and then especially this stuff here. And I'll link to at least some of these studies. I'm afraid that with the amount of studies cited in these wiki pages I've gone over, I'm afraid that my underbar is going to contain too many studies, and I'm not going to have enough space to write anything in there, so I may only link to some of these things, but you can just go straight to the page and gather them yourselves. Of course, they are at the bottom in the references section. And finally, since I raved about Glenn and John, I want to play a couple of clips from them just to give people a taste of what they're in for if they want to watch more of them. But I recently discovered on the Blogging Head site that their vlogs together stretch over a decade. So that's very impressive because the sort of arguments they're making now, they've been making them for a long time, but they discuss a whole lot more. So the whole catalog is worth going over as far as I'm concerned. But I'll just play a couple of clips from the recent edition, just as a hopeful little boost to what they're doing, because they need to be the dominant voices on this issue. Which is not to say that everything they say is agreeable. I can pick some bones with them, but I can pick some bones with everyone. But in terms of the least imperfect black voices, yeah, you're looking at them. And impressive, just how far back it stretches. So, a couple of clips now, and that'll be it for me this time around.
I think there are arguments against it. We are not the America of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We're not doing the sorts of things that Dean Acheson and Henry Kissinger casually oversaw. We get better. And on race, we get better, which means that Tamir Rice is going to be shot. You know, within the getting better, horrible things are sometimes going to happen, but it's better. And all I can see is that There's a certain kind of person who wants you to see the disproportionate amount of crime that's committed by young black men in the typical American city. And you can't gainsay the facts. You're supposed to see that, and you're supposed to understand that the reason for that is racism of an abstract kind. You're supposed to even think about, now you're supposed to think about 1619. You're supposed to think about redlining 50 years ago. That's a kind of sophistication, whether you find that those arguments hold up or not. We're all supposed to understand as we scarf down our hot dogs on the 4th of July, to use Ta-Nehisi Coates' line. As we're doing all that and celebrating the good things about America, we're supposed to understand that black problems are due to a complex cocktail of things. It's endlessly complicated. It's as complicated as the Talmud. It's what we often call the race thing. Everybody takes a deep breath and starts looking over each other's shoulders when it comes up because it's so damn complicated. But then when it comes to this issue of 1619 and the Revolutionary War and whether America has been worth doing, suddenly, all of a sudden, everybody goes down to the level of finger painting. All of a sudden, it's just, let's just chuck the whole thing. I find that radically inconsistent. Unless you're looking for a reason to feel good about yourself, in which case I genuinely pity somebody who gets their sense of worth out of painting themselves as a noble victim. I genuinely pity somebody who needs that kind of succor. Succor? I've never said that word before.
Yeah, I think it's succor.
Is it succor? Yeah, I'm never going to use that word again. But yeah, that's the problem, that this kind of thinking is so unsubtle. And there's so many people who can be drawn away from understanding that by the fact that they use a lot of big words. I'm disappointed. I am really disappointed in this.
Yeah, that's a very telling observation. We can do better as educated modern people than this, because of the fact the history is a lot more complicated than the fairy tale that you want to tell. And by the way, it's also more complicated than the opposite fairy tale, which is City on a Hill, everything's all perfect, right, and America a force for good without any critical dimension to it. They're going to be pro-life and very much influenced by that. They're going to be worried about the planet. And if you don't think the economic implications of dealing vigorously with a concern about the planet will hit hard at people who are on the margins of the economy, you've got another thing coming. The idea that you're going to employ all of these inner city people as building retrofitters when they can't read is absurd. Yes, I said it. Okay. Now, what do they need? You're asking me? They need school choice. I'm not asking you to agree with my policy positions. They need a complete revolutionary engagement with the delivery of educational services to disadvantaged people. They need public safety. The cops are their friends, not their enemies. Black Lives Matter ideology is completely wrong-headed. Mothers of the movement have no place at a Democratic Party convention that actually wants to represent the interest of Black people. They need hard-headed engagement with the actual problems, including the failures that confront their people across the socioeconomic landscape.